Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu wa salam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Inshallah, I'll continue with Imam al-Nawawi's Tibyan fi Adabi Hamalat al-Quran, translated as Etiquette with the Quran. Most of the material that will be covered in this book is also covered in the recent release of Imam al-Nawawi's Mukhtasar, or abridgment of the aforementioned works, published as Connecting with the Quran. So whichever one you have, you should be able to follow along with today's reading. I left off last time, I think on approximately page 76, and we're in the chapter on etiquette with recitation, which covers individual points of etiquette or proper behavior that reciters should observe while reciting the Quran. And we've gotten up to what ends up being one of the most complicated parts of the book, and that has to do with sujud as-sajda, or the sajda that's made for reciting particular verses of the Quran. And in the last session, I read up to a point where Imam al-Nawawi was covering the number of prostrations. And we're at the section where it says locations of the verses of prostration. And the author of our book, Imam al-Nawawi rahimahullah, says that the specific locations of the prostration verses are Al-A'raf, verse 206, Al-Ra'd, verse 15, Al-Nahl, verse 50, Al-Isra, verse 109, Maryam, verse 58, Hajj, which has 2, with them being verses 18 and 77, and then Al-Furqan, it looks like it's verse 60, An-Naml, verse 26, Sajda, verse 15, Fussilat, verse 38, An-Najm, verse 62, Al-Inshiqaq, verse 21, and Al-Alaq, verse 19. And if you have etiquette with the Quran, there's an appendix at the end of the book that I've added that will show you where the exact locations are. Next, Imam al-Nawawi says, there is no disagreement of any consideration as to their specific locations in the surahs, except for Fussilat, in which there is disagreement among the scholars. The opinion of a Shafi'i and his companions is that it is as we mentioned. It occurs immediately after Allah Most High saying, and are ever wearied. And this is at the 38th verse. This is the opinion of Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib, Muhammad ibn Sirin, Abu Wa'il Shaqiq ibn Salama, Sufyan al-Thawri, Abu Hanifa, Ahmed, and Ishaq ibn Rahoya, rahimahumullah. So obviously this opinion is endorsed by a large number of very well-known, prestigious, knowledgeable scholars. Others hold that it occurs immediately after Allah Most High saying, if you would worship Him. Also, this is at verse 37, so right before the previous opinion. Ibn Mundar related this from Umar ibn al-Khattab, al-Hasan al-Basri, and the companions of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, Abu Salih, Talha ibn Musarrif, Zubair ibn al-Harith, Malik ibn Anas, al-Layth ibn Sa'd. And it is also an opinion of one or more of the companions of Imam al-Shafi'i. May Allah be pleased with all of the aforementioned scholars of both opinions. And al-Baghawi related this in his book At-Tahdhib. As for the statement of Abu Hassan Ali ibn Sa'd al-Abdari, one of our Shafi companions, in his book Al-Kifaya, addressing the disagreement between the fuqaha about the prostration of Surah An-Naml occurring around verse 25, he said, this is the opinion of most of the fuqaha, And Malik said that the prostration occurs at verse 26. So he mentions an opinion of it being at 25, another one being at 26. This quote of his, according to our opinion and the opinion of the majority of the fuqaha, is not known or accepted. It is a manifest error. And the books of our Shafi companions are explicit that the verse of prostration occurs where Allah Most High says, Lord of the Formidable Throne, which is at ayah 26 of that verse. And Allah knows best. So notice here that Imam al-Nawawi is giving fairly heavy criticism again of Shafi'is and the work that they've done. And it's important to notice that this goes on in this book, and it goes on in other books of the madhahib. And why we need to notice this is that it shows that the madhahib were not static, and that there was a lot of self-criticism going on. So if a scholar came up with an opinion, it was still evaluated by later scholars to ensure that it was the strongest and the most authentic that they had. Okay, so if someone wants to say that once an opinion was made, it was treated as though it was infallible, all you have to do is open this book to this page and show them this passage. And there's an example right there of the scholars of a madhab criticizing the work of prior scholars in the madhab. So one of the beauties of the madhab system is that they were bodies of knowledge that were constantly reviewed over time. And so they were improved over time. And there's an example of it happening. Next, Imam al-Nawawi is going to talk about specific rulings concerning the verses of prostration. And he says, rahimahullah, prostration occasioned by the recitation of the Quran has the same general ruling as a supererogatory prayer, and that its conditions are that one must be cleansed of impurity, free of filth, face the Qibla, and have his nakedness covered. And these we covered them early on in this chapter, where Imam al-Nawawi talked about the need to have purity from both al-Hadath al-Akbar and Janaba, as well as to have purity from al-Hadath al-Asghar. So someone will need to have made ghusl, if they needed to make ghusl. And if someone had lost their wudu, they're going to need to make ablution. Okay, so prostration occasioned by the recitation of the Quran has the same general ruling as a supererogatory prayer. So he's going to make an analogy here. We will treat the sajda, even if it occurs outside of prayer, as though it is a prayer. And because of that, all of the same rulings of prayer will apply to it regarding its conditions. And so because of that, one needs to be cleansed of impurity. They have to be in the state of at-tahara. They have to be free of filth, meaning that their body can't have filth on it. They can't be carrying filth, and they can't be making their sajda on filth. And they must face the Qibla. They have to face the direction of prayer. And you must also have your awrah covered. So just like in prayer, those things must be done in order for you to make the sajda. So it is unlawful for anyone to make the prostration while he has legally inexcusable filth on his body or clothes, or has ritual impurity, unless he were to make dry ablution in a situation where dry ablution is permissible. So there are occasions where dry ablution is permissible for you to make as an alternative to having purification from water. So for example, someone who has a skin problem where water is going to make the skin worse, the problem worse, or it will initiate a problem, that would be a justification for making tayammum. Someone has a cut on their arm, and if they get water on it, it will get infected. They can make tayammum with all of the conditions that go with it and the way to do it. If someone doesn't have water, they can make tayammum. So in cases such as this, and they're covered exhaustively in books of fiqh, one could make tayammum instead of making ablution before making the prostration. Okay. So prostration is also unlawful when turned toward a direction other than the Qibla, except during a journey where supererogatory prayers are permissible when one is turned towards a direction other than the Qibla. This is mentioned also in the books of fiqh. And they mention what parts of a prayer someone would have to pray while facing the Qibla. And this is only for supererogatory or nafila prayers. Right? You're allowed, when praying non-obligatory prayers, to deviate from the Qibla in some parts of the prayer. And this is covered in fiqh books. And inshallah, you can pull it out there if you need these details. And all of this is agreed upon. Next, Imam al-Nawawi is going to return back to the issue of Surat Sad. And if you remember from the previous segment, he pointed out that the Shafis do not consider this to be a strongly emphasized verse of prostration. And here he's going to clarify what he means by it not being one of those strongly emphasized verses of prostration. And he says, one who says that reciting verse 24 of Surat Sad requires prostration holds, moreover, that he should prostrate whether he reads it during prayer or outside of it, treating it like all other verses of prostration. So the people who went with the opinion that the prostration during Surat Sad really needs to be done, they hold this opinion whether it was recited within prayer or outside of prayer. But Imam Shafi and others who claim that it is not one of the verses requiring prostration say that when one recites it outside of prayer, it is recommended to prostrate, since the Prophet ﷺ prostrated at its recitation, as we have mentioned. But if one recites it during the prayer, he should not prostrate. So notice when I translated here requiring prostration, this was a somewhat overly literal translation of what is in the Arabic. From what I recall, the Arabic says yelzam. It doesn't say yajib. And so when the word yelzam here isn't a fiqh ruling. It has more to do with that something ought to be done. It could be required, it could be recommended, but it covers both of those here. So it's not the best translation that I have there. So what he's talking about is that if it's recited outside of prayer, one really ought to do it. But it's not as strong as the other prostrations. But if one recites it during prayer, he doesn't prostrate it because it's not strong enough to modify the form of prayer. Okay, so if, however, one does prostrate it out of ignorance or forgetting that it is not required, it does not invalidate his prayer, though he should make a prostration of forgetfulness. But if one knew of the sound opinion that his prayer is rendered invalid by such a prostration because he added something foreign to the prayer, then his prayer is invalid. The same way it would be invalid if we were to make a prostration of thankfulness, a sujood of shukr, within his prayer. And there's no disagreement about this among the scholars. Okay? So what's going on here is that he says that if someone didn't know the ruling or they forgot it, and they went in and they made the prostration for Surat Sad while praying, okay, if they had this legally recognized form of ignorance, if they had a legal excuse here, then we could say that it doesn't invalidate the prayer, but they should make the sujood as-sahw, the prostration of forgetfulness, because they did this. But if they were aware of the ruling, if they're aware that it shouldn't be done during prayer, in that case, yes, it's going to break their prayer. Why? Because they've added something to the prayer where it doesn't belong. This additional sajda doesn't belong in the prayer, and it's not going to be done unless we have a strong reason to do it. Strong here being we have textual evidence that would affirm it for that particular act at that particular place. So what Imam al-Nawawi is saying is that just as we would break our prayer if we just added a random sajda, or if we added the sujood al-shukr inside the prayer. The same here. Making a prostration for a verse in the Quran that doesn't call for the prostration will break the prayer. Same thing. So that's his argument. If you had a legal justification for your excuse that excuses you to do it, fine. It's not going to break your prayer because you have that excuse. However, if you did know the ruling and you went ahead and did it, you're going to have to pay the consequence. And the consequence is what? Your prayer is invalid. You have to repay. And you have to repray. And this comes up in many other places in fiqh, where if you know that something is not allowed, if you know that something is haram but you don't know its consequences, you will still be held accountable for the consequences. So someone who doesn't know the consequences of engaging in intercourse while fasting during Ramadan, they know it's haram but they don't know the consequences, we're still going to hold them accountable for the consequences if they knowingly engage in the act with knowledge that it's unlawful. So ignorance of the punishment doesn't free you from the punishment. Knowing that something is unlawful would make you responsible for its consequences. So that's the argument that's being made here. And he says that when it comes to his analogy about giving it a ruling similar to sujood al-shukr inside of prayer, he says that the ruling regarding sujood al-shukr is something where there's no disagreement among the scholars. So if that's going to be the basis for the ruling for sujood al-sajda, okay, this is how it will work. And the second opinion is that it is not invalidated since it has an association to the prayer. So he mentions that there's two opinions regarding this, right? About what to do with sujood sajdati tilawa if it was done for sad. So the main opinion that he mentions, and it's the opinion that we will follow, is that if you do it, it breaks your prayer. If you do the sajda for Surah Sad inside of prayer, it's going to break your prayer because you're not supposed to do it. There's not a sufficient justification for it. That is the primary opinion. That's the Mu'tamad opinion. That's what we follow. But Imam al-Nawawi mentions that there is a second opinion that it would not be invalidated because the act has an association with the prayer. So that's the overruled ruling, and it's the ruling that we don't follow. Okay, so clearly this gives us a great answer for people who are praying individually and people who are praying behind other Shafi'is who have the same view regarding Surah Sad. But what are you going to do if you're a Shafi'i praying behind someone who does consider Surah Sad to be a verse worthy of prostration inside of prayer? What are you going to do then? And Imam al-Nawawi covers this next, and he says, if the Imam leading a prayer were to prostrate for verse 24 of Surah Sad, believing that it does call for the prostration, yet someone following him in prayer does not hold this view, he should not follow the Imam. Rather, he will extricate or remove himself altogether from praying behind the Imam, or he will remain standing waiting for the Imam to complete the prostration. So you're a Shafi following, for example, a Maliki, who considers this to be one of those places where you do make the sajda inside of prayer. What do? You have two options. Option number one is that you quit following the Imam. As soon as the Imam goes down into the sajda, you make an intention that you will complete the prayer on your own. Option number two is that you remain standing, waiting for the Imam to finish his prostration and come back up. And then Imam al-Nawawi continues for this latter one that I mentioned. And if he stands waiting for the Imam, he must perform a prostration of forgetfulness. This is a question. Okay. And if one does stand waiting for the Imam, must he perform a prostration of forgetfulness? Why? Because he departed from the Imam here. He had a justification for doing it. But are we going to say that he should do sujood sahwi for doing it? And he goes, there's two opinions among the scholars, one being that he should, one that he doesn't. And the preponderant opinion is that he does not. One of the reasons for this is that the Imam will carry the burden of any sort of sujood sahwi for the people behind him. So if there was a reason to do it, the Imam would be carrying it. But here, apparently, Imam al-Nawawi isn't even seeing that there's a reason for it, and Allah knows best. So if you're a Shafi who doesn't think that you should do the sajda inside of prayer for Surat Sad, and your Imam does make it, because he holds that you should, you have two options. One, you remove yourself from following the Imam. Two, you wait for the Imam to come up from his prostration, and then you continue following the Imam. And if you do that, there's no reason to make sujood sahwi at the end of the prayer. So this is what Imam al-Nawawi just covered. Next, he's going to talk about the issue of for whom it is proper to prostrate. And he says, it is an established prophetic tradition, it's a sunnah, for someone reciting a verse of prostration and who has ritual purity by way of water or soil, so whether they made wudu or tayammum, when tayammum is allowed, to make prostration whether or not the recitation was made during prayer or outside of it. Okay, so it is a sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ for someone reciting a verse of prostration who has wudu to make the prostration whether or not the prostration was made during prayer or outside of prayer. Now remember that you don't have to have wudu to recite from the Quran. So this is why he throws that in there, because it is permissible for you to recite Quran when you don't have wudu. You're not allowed to recite Quran when you need to make ghusl, but you can recite Quran when you should be making wudu. Okay, so if you have tahara when you recited the verse of prostration, you should make the prostration, right? This holds true for someone listening to the recitation. So the person who did the reciting should make the prostration. So should the person who was listening to the recitation. And moreover, it is established for someone who merely heard the recitation, though he was not particularly listening to it. So notice here that Imam al-Nawawi is listing three different ranks so far. The reciter, someone who's listening to the reciter, and someone who just heard the recitation. So the person doing the reciter, this is pretty obvious. This is someone who is actively reciting. And then we have the active listener. And then we have a passive listener. Okay, so someone who did the recitation, yeah, you can see why they should make it. Someone who's listening attentively, sure, that makes sense. Someone who merely heard it, so let's say you're in a store and you're shopping and they have Quran playing and oh, whoa, they just read Surat al-Alaq, and this is where we would typically make a prostration of recitation. And you weren't really listening attentively, but you heard it. Yes, you also should make that prostration. Okay, so he says, moreover, this is established for someone who merely heard the recitation, though he was not particularly listening to it. However, Imam Shafi said, I do not emphasize this for the one who merely overheard it, as I do emphasize it for the attentive listener. So in the shopping in the store, you happen to hear it scenario I mentioned, it's not so emphasized. So if you're in a store and you're actively listening to the recitation and they recite and you hear one of those verses, it is emphasized for you to make the recitation as someone who is attentively listening. If you just happen to overhear it and you have wudu, you could do it. It would be nice if you did it, but it's not so emphatically recommended. And this is the correct opinion. And Imam al-Haramain al-Juwayni, one of our Shafi companions, said that someone who merely heard the recitation does not prostrate. Okay, so we have this alternative opinion in the madhab from Imam al-Haramain, who was one of the greatest 5th century Shafis out there. and he's also one of Imam al-Ghazali's main teachers in Shafi fiqh. So the opinion comes from an incredibly learned Imam within the madhab, but it's not the opinion that the later Shafis considered soundest. Okay, so Imam al-Nawawi mentions the two opinions, the first being that someone who merely heard it isn't really recommended to do it, but they can. And then you have the opinion of Imam al-Haramain al-Juwayni rahimahullah, that someone who merely heard it just doesn't do it. So it's not even recommended for them to do it. They really shouldn't do it because they just randomly overheard it. However, the well-known opinion is the first, that one could do it, should do it, but it's not really a strong should. Okay? So that covers the rulings of someone who did the recitation, was actively listening, or was somewhat passively listening and overheard it. So whether or not the reciter was in or outside of prayer, it is established for the one who overheard the recitation and the attentive listener to prostrate. This holds true whether or not the one reciting actually prostrated himself. Okay, so we've got so many scenarios here. We have the scenario of the person reciting inside of prayer, and then someone praying behind him hearing it, or someone outside of prayer attentively listening to him do it, and someone outside of prayer overhearing him do it, right? So we've got all of those scenarios. And now we're going to split them, each one of those, into two additional sub-scenarios, because it's possible that the guy that was doing the recitation didn't make the sajda, and it's possible that he did. This is why I said that this section is probably the most complicated, because there's so many different potential scenarios here. So whether or not the reciter was inside or outside of prayer when he recited the ayah with the sajda in it, it is established, it is affirmed for the one who overheard the recitation and the attentive listener to prostrate. So someone is inside of prayer and they recited an ayah with a sajda in it, and the person who listened is outside of prayer, he still should make that sajda. And this holds true whether or not the one who did the recitation himself did the prostration. Great. So all of those potential scenarios, same ruling. If the verse with recitation is recited, we should make the prostration for recitation, whether it was recited during prayer or outside of prayer, and whether the person who did the recitation himself did the prostration or not. Great. This is the well-known and correct opinion according to the companions of Imam Shafi, and may Allah be pleased with them all. And it is what Abu Hanifa said as well, rahimahullah. And the author of Al-Bayyan, this is Al-Umrani, and Al-Bayyan is an interesting commentary on Imam Shirazi's Al-Muhadhab, and the Muhadhab is the base for Imam al-Nawawi's Sharh al-Muhadhab, also known as Al-Majmu'. The Bayan is interesting in that it doesn't include the Muhadhab word for word. Instead, what he does is he just makes a commentary. He paraphrases the original within his own commentary, which is quite interesting. Another interesting thing about the Bayan is that it's a complete commentary on Al-Muhadhab, whereas Al-Majmu'ah, Imam al-Nawawi didn't finish it. He went up to, I think, right before a riba, and then Imam as-Subki added a little bit more, and then a later scholar of the 20th century CE, he went through and he finished it. So one of the advantages of the Bayan is that it covers the entire book. Okay, so the author of Al-Bayyan, Al-Umrani, one of Shafi's companions. And here companion doesn't mean a direct contact. It means more like colleague. He said that a bystander listening to someone reciting a verse of prostration during prayer does not prostrate. As-Saydalani, one of Ash-Shafi's later companions, said that it is not established that he prostrates unless the one reciting prostrates, but the correct opinion in these cases was the first. There is no difference in the rulings concerning the verses of prostration if the one reciting is a Muslim, mature, in a state of ritual purity, or a male, or if the reciter is a non-Muslim, prepubescent, in a state of ritual impurity, or a woman. Okay, so notice this. Imam al-Nawawi says essentially that if the verse is recited and you hear it, it should be prostrated for. Okay, so it doesn't matter who did the recitation. So even if a non-Muslim does it, it should be done. So this could give us an answer to the question of what do we do if we listen to a recording? If it doesn't matter who did the recitation, then it probably doesn't matter whether it was recorded or non-recorded. So I haven't seen this mentioned. I haven't seen a contemporary faqih mention this issue. But if I was asked, I would say that this last sentence gives us a hint that even if we have a recording and we hear the sajda, we still should be doing it. Why? Because it was heard. And it was, right? It makes sense here, inshallah. Anyways, that's not an actual fatwa. It's just a thought. Because I'm reading this is what I would get out of it. And it's a modern application that people do ask about. So I'm not someone who can do ijtihad within the madhab, and I'm definitely not someone who can do ijtihad, period. So I can't do it within the madhab, and I can't do it in general. All I'm saying is that this appears to be a basis that we could use for getting to that answer. If I hear it, I'm going to make the sajda. Why? Because of what I read here. But that's not going to be a Shafi'i ruling, and may Allah forgive me for even getting myself into this pit of having to explain why I said it. Okay, this is the sound opinion of our school. Which is it? So he says, there is no difference in the rulings concerning the verses of prostration if the one reciting is a Muslim, mature, in a state of ritual purity, and male, or if the reciter is a non-Muslim, prepubescent, in a state of ritual impurity, or a woman. Okay, so regardless of who did the recitation and what state they were in, Imam al-Nawawi says the listener should do the sajda for it. This is the sound opinion of our school, and it is the opinion of Abu Hanifa rahimahullah. Some of our Shafi companions said that one does not prostrate if the reciter is a non-Muslim, prepubescent, in a state of ritual impurity, or intoxicated. Why? Because the things that he just mentioned, these are either people who are not religiously, religiously responsible for the acts, or they are barred from doing it. So a Muslim or a prepubescent, they're not morally responsible for doing the act to begin with. Someone who doesn't have ritual purity, if they're in a state of ritual impurity, they're not allowed to do the act. If someone is intoxicated, then they're also not responsible at the moment. So, wouldn't do it. Okay, so this is an opinion that is within the madhab. However, it's not the one that we follow. And a group of scholars among the righteous forebears, the Salaf al-Salih, said that one does not prostrate at a woman's recitation. So that opinion is there, but it's not the one we follow. And Ibn Mundhir conveyed from Qatada, Malik, and Ishaq the opinion I just mentioned. But the correct opinion is what we previously mentioned, which is what? That if a woman or a child or a Muslim or a non-Muslim, someone with ablution, someone without ablution, a child, someone who's intoxicated, if they recite the verse, we will go ahead and do the prostration. All of this just emphasizes the idea that if the verse is recited, it would occasion the prostration. And that is the opinion that we follow in the Shafi madhab. And this is all I'm going to read today. And inshallah, I'll be back soon. Until then, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.